Okay, folks, just testing the sound here. I'm here in my usual pregame, pregame for Unfound on the Ground number 19. The Disappearance of Charley Ross. This is pregame. Carrie, can you hear me? Just do a sound check. Just testing that, right? Testing sound. Yes, thank you, Carrie. Okay, so this is pregame, folks. I get in here early to test sound and to get some of the preliminary text here. Let me get the disclaimer up. Again, this is pregame. This does make it into the recording, as some of you know, or many of you know. And I'm getting the disclaimer texted, which I'll wait to read. Okay, please. Understood, Carrie. Understood. Understood. Close that. So, for those of you that watch this eventually, this is our usual pregame. We'll get started at 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time sharp. And I come in here to do the pregame to make sure the tech's in order. I am not streaming from North Dakota this time. I am in an undisclosed location traveling for the summer. But we get started in about 6 minutes here with the disappearance of Charley Ross. And so we'll do that. Hope everyone's doing fine. Again, when you watch this video, take a moment to uh, please consider liking this on YouTube and sharing it to. I just, yeah, there you go, Gary. It does have that allure to it, doesn't it, Gary? Um, so please consider liking the video here and sharing it. And if you're not already a subscriber to Unfound, go ahead and click the subscribe button. And I'm also going to go ahead and just share, just to get this done, episode number 11, where we did a historical overview of cases, which, of course, this disappearance of Charley Ross was one of them. And so that also, as always, please, the main website, the Unfound Podcast.com, the Unfound Podcast.com. Important website to stay up to date on everything Unfound. Please, if you don't go to that site, go to that site, share that site. Important. So we have about 4 minutes here. We're in the usual pregame. We'll get started straight away. We have 3 guiding questions that we're going to use. What do we know? What don't we know about the case? And then, like we've been asking with some of the recent historical cases we've been doing on the ground, what can we apply from what we've talked about in sort of this on the ground series to this case in particular? And there are certainly some things that come up um, for that. Um, so that's that. Again, if you're, well, we'll have some folks participating tonight, but then on a time frame, Ed and the team will make this episode available in a couple weeks. And at that point, this will be available on YouTube. And we will ask folks again to share it, to like it, Carol, how are you? Hello. We have about 3 minutes before we begin, and we'll go from there. Again, if you're watching this live or you're going to watch this eventually, please go ahead and like this video and share it. And if you're not a subscriber, when you do watch this, if you're not a subscriber on YouTube to the Unfound Podcast Channel, go ahead and subscribe. Hope everyone's doing well tonight. So far, we have Carrie here. We have Carol. Again, hello to everyone. We have about 2 minutes until we begin. I will start straight away with the usual disclaimers, and then we will get into the episode. We did make a shift recently to a about an hour format, um, and I know that's been mentioned on Facebook, and Ed might have explained some of this, but this is what we're doing. We're still using the same approach. We still have an interactive learning framework, but we want to tidy up a bit on time and go from there. But we're still getting into incredibly substantive discussions. Hard to believe. We're on episode 19 for Unfound on the Ground. So we have about a minute, and then we'll begin. Hope everyone's doing well, for sure. I am going to start now here, just getting going with the usual disclaimers, which I've put in the text too. The disappearance of Charley Ross, that's this episode number 19. We'll be recording video and audio, including the text chat. Chat participation's your option for the journalistic, promotional, and/or commercial purposes of Unfound. The audio and video recording, including the text chat of this digital meeting, will be distributed by Unfound. By participating in this digital meeting, you agree to give Unfound permission to use the rendering of your words for journalistic, promotional, and/or commercial purposes with no compensation to you from Unfound, its assistants, its affiliates, its partners, etc. Hello, Paula. My name's Eric Grabowski. I'm been a guest once on Unfound. I'm part of Ed's assisting team, and and I am primarily in academia as a communication professor, associate professor, but on the side I do some cold case journalism and obviously some collaboration here with Ed and the team on Unfound. As always, my words don't necessarily reflect the views of my employing institution. And if there's any disclaimers you want to give tonight, please do so. Again, theunfoundpodcast.com. Visit it often. Tonight we're talking about the disappearance of Charley Ross. Hello, Kathy. Welcome back. Good to see everybody. I did share the link there for episode number 11, which of course that was our historical overview. We did mention this case. Obviously an important lead in, and I'm also sharing the link for Ed's interview of Megan Good of the Charley Project. And the Charley Project is named after Charles Brewster Ross. Right, so this is really how I learned about the case a while ago, and I think probably how many do, although the case has had some national exposure over the years. But it is a significant case, as we'll see. We know that the Charley Project is a tremendous resource in the missing persons interest community, cold case community, and so forth. Obviously, as we always say, we're admirers and respecters of Megan's work. But I desperately recommend, if you haven't listened to that episode, do so. um, for sure. Um, so we have three questions that we're working with, and what do we know and what don't we know? Two questions there about the disappearance of Charley, and then of course, as always, from based on things that we have learned about, talked about on the various episodes of Unfound on the Ground, what can we apply? Of course, on Megan's blog, there she has some commentary from her about the case overall. It's a good source. As we know, Megan strives for accuracy. On any of those blog posts, you can read some of the comments. Of course, some of those are more substantive than others. Um, there was one from a few years ago when Megan mentions that there was a podcast involving the case and her. I have not listened to that as of yet. I do plan on it at some point. But so on the front end, as I start through what we know, what we don't know, please interact and interject. As always, I'll go through on the text. Um, we do have, and again, Ed's suggestion, and I believe that came from Megan. I have the book here written by the father, Mr. Christian Ross, um, and it was published not long after the abduction. And so I thought it important to work through this book. Again, Ed's suggestion, I think that came from Megan to Ed, and it's mentioned there in the various discussions. I'm going to highlight some things from the book that point to the case itself, as well as some things that, even with some changes in circumstance and technology over time, are still relevant. So, um, just a couple really interesting things. It's a really sad case, of course. Um, and I have just a couple other relevant sources here. There's Library of Congress back in 2019 by a Neely Tucker, um, posted by Neely Tucker, and then put together by a Heather Thomas. And it's nice here because when you go through the hyperlinks in the article, hello, Linda, the it links to some of the older newspaper references that are available through Library of Commerce and so forth. And again, back to the Pennsylvania Center for the Book, which I've mentioned for different cases on occasion, which has some good references. And I believe in episode 11, I referenced this one. If you scroll to the bottom, there's a bibliography there if one were to do research. And I'll be honest with you, they're actually, this many years later, there's still actually, as we'll see, some things to research pertaining to this case. So, what do we know? What don't we know? Okay, so Kathy, apparently the abductors had approached Charley and his brother previously to the abduction to make the kids feel like these guys were not strangers. That seems to be the case, based on my reading of the book by Charley's father. And so Candy was involved. These guys were getting on the scene, talking about candy, distributing candy, and even up to the point of the abduction in 1874, July. It was then about candy and firecrackers or fireworks, too. Um, and yeah, they tried to build trust um, with the kids there in the neighborhood, and and basically what had happened is they got Charley and then his brother Walter to get into the buggy. Okay, we're dealing with the buggy age here, and the idea was then that um, they could go to this store, and Walter could go in and purchase, and and they basically rode away with Charley. Walter's recollections were able to be helpful in terms of getting some initial information to the family and to the authorities. Let me just go right from the book about the two children here. And again, this is from the father. At the time of the abduction, Walter was nearly 6 years old, having been born October 12th, 1868. And then Charley was born May 4th, 1870. It was about 4 years and 2 months old when he was stolen. So we're dealing with relatively youngsters. Carrie is where "Don't Take Candy from Strangers" came from. Yeah, there's so much about this case that obviously sort of set a lot of awareness and action trends came from. In fact, in the Library of Congress link that I just sent, that's the bold there, right? Don't take candy from strangers. Um, so this became a ransom case. So Walter went into the store um, to buy the fireworks, and then again the buggy was gone. And then over a period of time, and it's really difficult to read. It's there's a lot of emotion to this book because you're getting, and he doesn't write it to be sensational or sensationalistic. Um, he's doing this because obviously he wants to deal with the realities of his missing child in the hope that, and as we'll see, although we probably did seemingly find out at least two of the key players, at least through the time in this book, and I would say to this day, Charley was never found, alive or dead. There's an interesting quote here from the book, and this is in some ways in the context of him, Mr. Ross, having to discuss this in the context of having to slowly break the news to his wife as things were unfolding. She was away in Atlantic City. But there's a quote here in this book, I think, that speaks to, even to this day, what folks deal with when we're dealing with missing persons, particularly missing children. And this is from, at least in the version I have, page 53. The publication of private griefs is rarely admissible, but the loss of our child is so atrocious a way has taken such a hold upon public sympathy that there seems to be a necessity for violating the sanctity of home and giving to the world that which otherwise would have been kept sacredly within our own hearts. So this was such a severe situation that, and appropriately, and at times, it's a difficult read what that family was going through over the course of weeks and months in dealing with these ransom letters. This is also basically what seems to be the case, as far as we can tell, of basically what was the earliest kidnapping for ransom in the United States of a child. So that that is significant. Again, if anyone wants to chime in while we're going, please do so. So, over a period of time, there were ransom letters, 23 total. Although interestingly, in the father's book, either the 21st one or the 22nd one, there was a 21 or 22 and a half. So, I want to, as I study this case further, want to look at that timeline on the letters. But regardless, 23 is the number you see, and basically they were demanding, going forward, these kidnappers, $20,000 for Charley's release. If you read through the letters and when you go through the book, you'll see Mr. Ross. And by the way, let me give you the book is in print, um, and it's in print through a company, Forgotten Books. I bought it on Amazon, but here's the direct link to their. If you again, if you want to buy it, if you want to read it, it's important to give credit. But as you read through so when you go through the book, you go through the various letters. The actual copies of the letters are provided in the book. But then the father, Christian Ross, gives commentary or discussion or recounts aspects of the letters. These were pretty sophisticated criminals. You can tell from start to finish, and again, Mr. Ross um, comments on this. They were very concerned about not just getting the money, but getting the money in such a way and arranging some sort of um, meeting in such a way that they wouldn't get caught, that the money wasn't going to be able to be traced. Looks like the book would be great to read. Yeah, if you're going to get to know the case, and Ed and Megan were right to really read this, and it just opened up so many more questions. And I think I said in the Crater episode, well, this is something that could get on my horizon in the future. But I think on this one, I'm going to be studying this case more, and you'll see why. There's some contemporary things we'll get to. Um, that where there's still some questions about this case, some debates, um, but you'll see these criminals were very sophisticated, or at least seemingly so, in not wanting to get caught. There was some back and forth. The use of the newspaper in terms of Mr. Ross sort of communicating with them, and then they'd respond with letters. Um, it's the other thing that's difficult, and you can see sort of the family having to grapple with this, but also sort of collaborating with law enforcement and community leaders, and eventually the Pinkerton detectives. The Pinkertons were brought into this. Is uh, grappling with the idea of paying and then not paying the ransom, because you know if especially now think of this. This is something new on the scene, right? So the abductors are saying, "Hey, give us this money." This is they're asking for money well above $20,000. Even some of the initial rewards that were put out for information and so forth. And even as time went on with rewards, these criminals were on it like, "Hey, this is about us getting this money for the safe release of the child. We're not looking to get caught. You know, you honor your side of it, we'll honor our side of it." And they were pretty clear throughout that if money was not paid, or if things were done to try to trick them or to get them caught, so forth, right, that Charley could end up dead. Okay. So that was a reality, or at least what's very much seemed to be a reality if you read through this, um, of what they were having to deal with. But then grappling with the idea of not actually dealing with this ransom from the standpoint of not setting a trend, right? Not wanting to empower these and other criminals who would then go on a trend to think it's okay to all of a sudden start abducting children to demand money from parents. So imagine having to be, in the first, you know, in the family that first had to deal with this. Very difficult. Of course, even in those days, good police work. Um, Page 41 onward, Mr. Ross recounts some of the initial questions that the police had to ask in terms of, right, are there any, you know, grudges against your family, any situations that we should be aware from, Mr. Ross was fairly well off, although there was some financial trouble that, particularly tied to the um, stock market problems of 1873. And again, I'm also referencing here this Library of Congress blog post that I shared. And so, he did have some difficulties, just quote unquote coming up with the money. Again, he was a person of means, and he was spending a lot of time and energy right on the front end collaborating with family and authorities. There were people stepping up, and he recounts some of this in the book, who wanted to help financially and otherwise. Um, there was at least one case he talks about in here with detail where he turned down some of that generosity. But the police were certainly trying to get at, any sort of leads in terms of, did anyone have anyone against the family? Were there any difficult family relations and so forth? Things that you would expect to be the case nowadays. Um, the uh, the plight of the family is very difficult on this. Of course, Mrs. Ross having to deal with this too, as well as both immediate and extended family. The other thing they had to deal with, and this in some ways very much nowadays, although with some shifts in technologies and so forth, a lot of false leads, um, some, I guess, well meaning, um, but and it took up time of looking into it, but also people trying to sort of scam and blackmail and so forth. Um, and so uh, people trying to exploit the situation over time, and the Ross family and forward in time, which obviously is sad that when someone's going through something like this, people would try to run their own scam to scam the public and to deceive the family. Um, that becomes a problem. We know nowadays, right? When you're trying, when law enforcement and journalists and so forth are trying to navigate a case, and obviously you get a lot of well-meaning false information, but sometimes people step up who aren't connected to the case and knowingly give false information. Okay, so over a period of time, weeks turned into months, and the, so the names of the two key people here, Joseph Douglas and a William Mosher, Mosher. Um, they were involved in a burglary in New York, and in that burglary, those guys were shot, and Mosher had died, and then this Joseph Douglas had basically confessed that they were involved in this, and that eventually then Walter would help identify um, one or both of the men, and so that was part of it. There was someone who would be put on trial as part of it later, William Westervelt. He was brother-in-law to Mosher, and again, Mr. Ross goes into some details about the trial in the book. And out of that trial, out of Westervelt's words and so forth, the idea that Charley was still alive. Of course, this was something that would be an open question, and there's so many old newspaper articles about it. Um, and Mr. Ross, within a couple years, wrote this book, The Father Story of Charley Ross, the Kidnapped Child. Full title containing a full and complete account of the abduction of Charles Brewster Ross from the home of his parents. And then the Walter's full name, and just because he has a picture of him on the front end here, um, let me get that in a second for you. I should have had that noted. My apologies for not. There was also an introduction in here by a Charles Krauth, Krauth, Vice Provost of the University of Pennsylvania in Norton, Professor of Theology in the Lutheran Theological Seminary, Philadelphia, and so forth. And I think the idea there was to attest to the importance of the narrative and character and sincerity of Mr. Ross as an author, and that's interesting. Let me just turn to our group here and see if anyone here has any comments. Anything I've said that you've heard or not heard anything anyone wants to add to this. Um, there are many books out there. Are they all same book? So um, th- this book is very distinct, as you'll see if you read it, and it's Walter Lewis Ross was Walter's full name. However, there is another book that I'm aware of. Um, there might be. So let me. One is, and this book is actually cited by um, Megan, and this was published in '67 by a Norman Zierold, Zierold. That's Little Charley Ross, America's First Kidnapping for Ransom. Um, haven't been able to find out if that book's in print. There's the Google Books. There's really not a lot shown by Google Books, but that at least will give you the reference information. Um, that's a key book for sure. Um, does that answer your question, Linda? If you could clarify, there are many books out there. They're the same book. So those are this original book by Mr. Ross, though. I mean, there may be other versions. Again, I got the one through this Forgotten Books. I've almost never heard of a child abduction with ransom money demanded in which the child is kept alive. So this is the interesting thing. When you're reading the account from Mr. Ross, they were getting so around the time of the 23rd letter. Part of that timeline is, you know, they were moving closer to some sort of um, resolve in certain aspects of the back and forth. But then the question would be: is with this burglary in which they were caught, did they intend to keep Charley alive? Was he alive incidentally? If he did die, was he murdered, or was it that, and as some think, and again, just different accounts that you read. Could there have been an accidental death? Could he have died eventually, etc.? Carrie, brother was able to ID one of the suspects due to the suspect having a bone disease, cancer, caused him to lose the cartilage. Yeah, he had a nose issue. And so that original identifying characteristic that Walter had in his mind when then he saw one of the two guys there, he was able to identify him. So Walter's recollection from the front end was pretty significant, both in the father's account and other things I've read. They have different copyrights, so I didn't know if newer books. No, I don't think there's an exclusion. For instance, this version I have here by Forgotten Books, it's everything. It's everything. Um, so if they were able to obtain a later copyright, and just keep in mind the varying copyright laws, I think this version, based on, and I'm someone who, looks. I'm not a used book expert, but I'm familiar with books and just seeing books, and I'm confident enough that they have included everything in terms of illustrations, renderings of the letters, the introduction, the various excerpts of letters and letters of support that Mr. Ross provides, and so forth. Yeah, I'm going to hold this up again. Can you see that, Linda? And I put the website out there if you need me to put it again. Okay. It's yep, it's out there. Here it is. Let me get this one more time. And I'm just going to put this out there one more time. It's not coming up well. If you scroll up in the chat, you'll find it. It's for some reason it's not rendering properly from that because of the YouTube redirect. Now, interestingly, over time, and you'll see this discussed, and this is where I think this gets interesting. So here, so in terms of what we don't know, right, is what happened to Charley. If you look back, and of course, from the writing of Mr. Ross's book forward in time, through the decades, right? People claiming to know where Charley was or claiming to be Charley and so forth. One notable um, is in 1930. So there was a guy who went by the name Gustav Blair. Um, and in 1939, a court in Arizona did rule um, based on the story that he had told and recollections that he claimed to have. And again, the Library of Congress blog post that I posted has this. Um, Basically, they said that he was Charley Ross. However, the Ross family did not buy into this, and there really isn't um, that idea didn't get acceptance. Now, I'm generally cautious with Wikipedia. Not that there aren't true things on Wikipedia, there are, but even as I tell my students, right, the um, problem with Wikipedia is that there's not adequate editorial review. However, in this case, when looking at that, I did notice a claim in there that I had to mention here and then follow a little bit. And this opens a door. Um, so, a claim that was made in that Wikipedia overview, and I followed the referencing, right, which is a good practice, is that this Gustav Blair, right, basically the Wikipedia article claims that the claim can't be held up because of DNA. So I followed the reference there, and it's interesting because it goes to, and this is something that I think gives some contemporary relevance to it, and this also loops into our third question, right? What are some things that would be, if you wanted to research this? So the Wikipedia um, article links to this blog that these folks claim that they're related to this Gustav, and they basically provide the name of the report. I am Charley Ross, and it basically goes into an analysis, genealogical, which is an interest of mine, a genealogical analysis that basically goes through some things about this Gustav, um, and basically some things that raise some questions about his narrative and his character, but basically get into um, from a genealogical standpoint, particularly DNA. It can't be him. It's not him, and so forth. So, not that there weren't people questioning that anyway. Like I said, the family never accepted that it was. But I think this is interesting because this is some fairly recent material. This is something I'm going to continue to look more into, and if there's anyone that uh, was going to sort of revisit this case, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and I think even before this source, this idea that ruled out Gustav, it was reasonable to say that Charley Ross was never found anyway, alive or dead. But it does get interesting because when you look back at the old newspaper articles, um, and the claims of people that they knew about Charley, or hey, I'm Charley Ross, or whatever, there was, uh, it is interesting to see how those things eventually sort of come around again. Kathy, there was a case in Hawaii in which a mentally unstable mom left her stroller with her son in at a neighbor's or acquaintance's, and about 30 years later, the little boy saw his age recreation at 30. Wow. And there are times when that sort of thing does happen, and those things should be tested. Um, Now, in the case of like with a Gustav Blair, Um, is it, whether that's the case of someone sort of buying into a deceptive, or, they think it's the truth and it's not, or some people authentically being mistaken. Obviously, when there were a lot of people sincerely giving leads to Mr. Ross about, we think Charlie might be here, we think Charlie might be there, and of course, this is closer to the 1870s. A lot of sincere people. And one of the things about this case is, you'll see, besides sort of setting the tone for now being concerned about abductions and kidnapping for ransom, and this setting off more awareness legally and politically about this sorts of thing, you'll see through here and other sources too, that this did give a broader awareness about the problem of children who were missing, right? The idea of a missing child wasn't brand new. This was a particular type of case. And yes, obviously they had some means and some connections, but you'll see it brought a lot of, to the extent possible in those days, regional and national attention to the problem of missing and abducted children. When you go through, for instance, and let's just, newspapers.com, or you go to some of the links on the National Archives, I mean, you'll see a number of older, um, newspapers, articles, even in the 60s, of course, when the Zerold book comes out, Little Charlie Ross, America's First Kidnapping for Ransom, you would see some discussions in the papers in the 60s, where they're talking about the book and the story, and about, people who were posting rewards, right? At one point, P.T. Barnum offered a $10,000 reward for Charlie Ross. Um, he hoped to get that sum back and make a big profit by placing Charlie on exhibition. That was reported here, Knoxville Sentinel, News Sentinel, 1967, of course. That's from the book. Um, these cases get awareness over time. And if you go to even in 1970, this is the news, Patterson, New Jersey. This is right. If Charlie Ross is alive today, he's nearly 100 years old. And this is from Harry Golden, right? And he goes into this idea of just a look back on the case, sort of an overview. Again, this was so the case does get some exposure over time. Again, if you were to look in, there's a lot. If you go to newspapers.com, again, that's a paid site. If you go to the National Archives, Library of Congress, right, searching the chronicling America, that's one for sure. I would suggest, if you want to get to know the case, and again, it was good that Ed and again Megan had said, read this book. And it kind of is toward the end of the book. Obviously, you get the feel from the family, right? Just not know, even as they seemingly knew what had actually happened with these criminals, not knowing whether Charlie, for sure, whether Charlie was dead or alive, and having to live with that. Okay, Linda, I just ordered the book. Right, just ordered the book. Um, so the family, you get a really good overview of what the family had to deal with in here, and let me just mention some of our usual. So, okay, so one of the things. So let's just go to our third question now, and again, anything you want to have chime in with. We've gone over some things we know. We've gone over some things we don't know. Um, and I shared with you this blog, making some genealogical claims. Um, and that this Gustav Blair was not Charlie Ross. And so they just talking about their own family, and basically that this guy had deceived um, the public, and they rely on historical, genealogical, and including DNA evidence. So that's one lead in genealogically. Obviously, there's just the general advice that, and others have done this, of course, but the you know getting to know more about the Ross family, obviously, you know thinking about forward in time. Now, this is the kind of case when I say, well, someone out there knows someone or knows someone who knows something, gets a little difficult when the case is in the 1870s. However, right, and again, I haven't weighed strongly the claims of this blog yet or other sorts of things out there. People claiming to have some historical connection to either a claimant to be Charlie Ross or some dispute of that claimant through direct or indirect family or circumstantial sort of happenings. Or, it would be interesting even this many decades later to kind of get to know, you know, historically. I mean, this is Germantown, PA is where this happened. This is sort of in the Philadelphia suburban area. As time went on and the ransom notes continued, and as the sort of the criminals widened their scope of being cautious with regard to the law and being caught, and you can see they were involved in other crimes, which took things up to New York. So a lot of historical interest there. Um, Kathy, I can't imagine losing a child in any manner. You would never get over it. Linda, especially when you have no real closure. Absolutely, for sure. Um, right. Okay. I'm going to just, another obviously area that we talk about, even if we did a Google News archive search, right? It's going to lead us to some of the same things. Again, if we just put in Charlie Ross, right, and then search the archive. Okay. And I'm going to just go here. You're gonna let me just put that up here. The over about 4 months. So there are 23 letters. The plight of the family was about 4 months. Okay. So because on the and you can see this. Yep, it's about 4 months. 3 to 4 months is when there was back and forth of the 23 letters. But that's an important question. The father gives a pretty good timeline. Um, Yep, and you can see different claims in some of the old newspaper articles. So again, newspapers.com, you got the Library of Congress, and then the Google News Archives, right? Those would definitely um, genealogical and even some of these discussions from that blog. Did the family and the kidnappers write back and forth? Yes. So what had happened was once, so what the kidnappers would get the letters through postal channels to the Ross family, and for much of that time, the Mr. Ross, Christian Ross, would often in the local newspaper communicate certain ideas back and forth, not extensively at length, just pretty concise back and forth. Then they would generally be responsive. Now, over the course of the 23 letters, and this is where reading the book's important, there's some nuances, and it's sort of interesting to see. Now, one of the things that Mr. Ross talks about, which is quite interesting, is the criminals, and part of it may be their actual writing style, but they might have been changing certain things to sort of mask who they were, at least in some cases. There was a very definitive message, and this was difficult for the family, right? Sort of, you do this or else, right? That Charley was at risk. We want the $20,000. We don't want, you're basically sort of in a weird, sinister way, putting it on Mr. Ross to stay good to his word and not try to deceive them, not put them at risk, because that could also put Charley at risk and so forth. So there was a sort of negotiation going on too. Okay, you would think there would have been some way to follow the letters back. They were trying to do that. There was some discussion by Mr. Ross in here about some ways that they were trying to trace and follow um, some of the letters and that the patterns of the letters and origin of the letters. Of course, there were times when, remember, there was a lot of public discussion as the weeks went on about this case. So even the criminals were seeing this. And so that in some ways created some static for the back and forth. Obviously, they were antagonizing the family. Keep in mind, again, the criminals were trying to protect themselves from getting caught. Eventually, basically, what had happened too is in the before the time of the burglary that went bad for the criminals, the two guys, is there was an informant that stepped up that was able to start giving information. Particularly, I think it was about Mosher, and there were the authorities were and the Ross family were kind of getting on to who they were after and who they were looking into. And so toward the end of the letters and with the informant, and then eventually with the botched burglary, that's when they obviously had an idea of who was involved in the abduction. You would think that there would have been some way to follow the letters back. Yeah, and so that's what they were trying to do. But of course, the burglar, the two guys were, and whoever else was involved, were very definitive about, you know, we're not looking to get caught. Don't try to set us up. This could still put Charley at risk, right? Um, so these were bad guys. These were not good guys for sure. Um, so we have old newspaper. If you were to research this case, obviously you have this book and the 1967 book that we mentioned. There's some sources here at the bottom of the Pennsylvania Center for the Book link, which I sent out. I would, of course, spend a lot of time with the old newspaper articles, okay, some of the genealogical discussions. Wonder if it was a false confession since he was dying and maybe wanted to be remembered in history. That is definitely a legitimate thing, Linda, but all indications based on the later trial of the third guy, Westervelt, and what the informant was able to provide and some of the circumstances, yeah, the abductors were criminals. They were criminals. There's no doubt about it. I can't remember off the top of my head if they had convictions, but they were known bad guys, Kathy. These were shady characters. Mosher in particular, but both of them. This Westervelt, um, he had a fine, and well, I think he had a fine, and then he spent some time in prison. Um, he was convicted on certain parts of that, but yeah, I don't think that this was a be remembered in history. Although that's a plausible consideration, right? That someone wants to be remembered as kind of like to our discussion about Hoffa, right? There's so many different ideas and theories and claims out there, but in this case, it seems to be based on everything I've looked at that they caught at least two or three of the people involved. Maybe there were more people involved, but as far as I'm concerned, Charley Ross has never been found dead or alive, which in itself is still relevant. In terms of ongoing research, I think some of the claims and weighing some of the claims of, for instance, this Gustav Blair and even others, although that seems to be the one that took the most attention, um, would be important. I think this case and also If you just obviously, but that's 1870s. This is 2022. Obviously, so many things have shifted and changed, but some things haven't. Some of the block and tackle about trying to grapple with this sort of case. Were any of them intelligent to think to change the writing and the spelling? Well, in some of the letters, there is some um, what seems to be, at least from the viewpoint of Mr. Ross, and I think a reasonable observer. Of course, one would have to do a little bit more research about some of the renderings of those days. It does seem to be that the ways in which certain aspects of some of the letters were presented did change the style and the content in a way to, at least from the viewpoint of the criminals, to divert attention or make it more difficult to find out who they are. Yes. And if you read the book, you'll see um, Mr. Ross gets into some of that in there, and he provides commentary on the letters, but he also, I think, for most of them, if not all of them, he provides renditions of the letters. So he gives uh, a typed overview. He gives again some of the actual copy of the letters, and then some of his own commentary of the letters, for sure. So, yep, there seems to be some of that. Um, I mean, did any of the criminals have a higher type IQ? I don't know that in terms of their if uh, they were clearly sophisticated criminals. They were skillful criminals, but I don't know about the rating of their intelligence. One of the letters, Kathy, one of the letters included in a blog I read, about half the words were misspelled. Horrible composition. Absolutely. Um, yep. For instance, U was spelled like YU. In fact, interestingly, there were some times when I was looking through some of the overview of the letters as provided by Mr. Ross. It was like, okay, this is over 100 years before texting and social media, and we know nowadays, of course, people use all sorts of shorthand. And I'm not saying at times that can't be functional or practical, but that sort of prompted that for me. Um, so yes, there was some of that. When the informant came on the scene, and the police, and the authorities, and the Pinkertons, and family members, obviously there were patterns in the writing. Again, over the course of 23 letters, where they were trying to and seemingly were able to identify some patterns that could be connected to one or both of the perps. Um, and again, that ended up going down in the burglary for sure. Any other suggestions? We have about 10 minutes here. Any other suggestions about if you were to get into this case now, what else, what sort of research? And again, if you, whether you're participating now or you're watching this later, please, if you like it, like the video, share the video. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. Any idea if the misspellings were consistent through the letters, like the word you? Yes, if you look in a lot of the letters, you'll see certain um, consistency. So, for instance, sometimes they sell Mr. Ross, often spell Mr. Ross ROS. YU is another one that comes up. Um, YU is one you see a lot for sure. There's, let's see here. There's, once I saw suppose, SUPOS. Um, there's some times where there's problems with capitalization, right? Again, like Kathy was saying, horrible composition overall. Um, uh, so capitalization not happening at times when it should be. Um, but it is interesting when you read these closely. There's a definite message there, right? Don't mess with us. Don't try to deceive us. Give us this money. Here's the money we want. Um, and your son is at risk, right? And there were things in the letters that that did reflect. certain realities about the family or about Charley that did indicate that this was all credible, right? And so that these guys were serious and weren't messing around. And again, one of the things here that's interesting is just, the Ross family and the authorities and the police and having to grapple with the issue of, right, do you pay this ransom or do you not pay the ransom, right? Because you don't want to set a trend. You don't want to all of a sudden now put a situation out there where, if one family pays, then more and more criminals get bold to start doing this more often. While at the same time, you're grappling with the idea that if you don't pay, these guys seem really serious that they'll kill Charley. So, any other suggestions about this? This is a case, again, Megan. So, we're big fans of Megan. I certainly would like to encourage folks to go ahead, and I had shared and in Megan's blog, she has a couple posts. I am going to take some time, and I haven't yet. She says in the one of the blog posts that there was a podcast. Should listen to that, um, for sure. I actually am going to get. I'm going to pursue some things on this case. Um, there's some really interesting historical aspects. Obviously, you're back to the 1870s. Um, yeah, though any idea the way the letter was worded was so awkward, like they were from another country or century. Do we? Yeah, that's true, Kathy. Do we know? Did they try to find other things written by the criminals to compare writing? So when the so one thing for sure that comes out in the text, um, and Mr. Ross gets into this in the book, is when they were able to get an informant, and the informant was able to attest to certain aspects of the um, writing. And I can't remember off the top of my head if he was able to provide any concrete comparison, but he persuaded the authorities that he had enough knowledge to be legitimate as an informant, that was able to provide some insights on the question of the letters. But back to the Kathy and others here, there definitely was some intentional uh, scrambling of proper writing and composition and capitalization and spelling to try to throw off the public, to throw off the family, and to throw off the authorities. Not everything became public right away. Things only became public when Mr. Ross. There's certain things that it took time to be made more public, and so obviously there's some things they kept close to the vest as needed, um, to try to deal with these guys, for sure. We have about 5 minutes. Any other key questions or suggestions for ongoing research? I know for me, just examining this book closely is important. Reading some of the later materials, the genealogical angle is interesting to me, particularly with regard to some of the what I believe to be false claimants of Charley Ross. I think the important question is still is what happened to Charley. I think this is something even this many years later, should still plague us in a way or push us. Do you believe the letters were fixed to appear that they were stupid? I do. That's my impression, or that they were really trying to look that way, because it seems really over the top at times. Um, there's no doubt about it. But I believe this is the criminals doing this. Right? I don't think anyone else had a hand in that, Linda. If that would, I'm not sure if you're implying that or not, but I definitely think that the criminals wrote them in a certain way, based on the account of Mr. Ross, um, to be perceived a certain way as criminals, to be diverting that. It also kind of gives it a certain emphasis rhetorically. Um, and it's interesting because when you're reading the book, you'll see that he often provides copies of certain things. He provides sort of a typed overview, and then Mr. Ross provides some of his own commentary. Okay. Any other key questions? Again, as always, let me give you the usual reminders. The unfoundpodcast.com. Please visit, share that site. Um, this is a fascinating case. Do we know the distance between the letter writers? Do you mean distance in time, Linda, or distance as they moved? Because based on the account in the book, this obviously happens around the Germantown, Pennsylvania area, which is a Philadelphia suburb, and then and again some of that as they moved. So it seems to be the case that as they moved, there could have been some distance in the later letters, especially if they were encroaching out of the state or to New York. I think you mean distance and not time, right? So distance in terms of where they were. That is part of the account, as you'll see if you read the book. So the letters initially were seemingly coming from closer rather than further, but towards the end, it seems as if, at least based on the account of Mr. Ross, that the geographic scope had widened. But yeah, they made it a point to make sure to get it to Mr. Ross. Yep. Does that answer your question, Linda? Okay. Any other key questions? Yeah. Yeah, yep. But the idea, yes, I think you're right, Carrie, that there was always a PA zip code, but that or postmark, yep, but that the origin or especially toward the end, they were widening out their distance. I don't know if it necessarily made its way to New York, but that they were widening out, right, as things were heating up. Keep in mind, this went over the case of 3 to 4 months, for sure. Okay, so we have about a minute or two. As always, theunfoundpodcast.com. Thanks to everyone who participated in there. And maybe for this case, it's a little more difficult to say someone out there knows something or knows something or knows someone who knows something. But I think that as a general principle, as I always say, someone out there knows someone who knows something or knows someone who knows something. At least in this case, that might be just people who may know more about the case or may have some interesting historical claims, whether that pertains to items directly or indirectly related to their family or some part of their family legacy. Um, so this has been helpful. I hope that with our new hour format, we're condensing it a bit, but it's still very substantive and interactive. Thanks to everyone who participated. Again, this was Unfound on the Ground number 19, The Disappearance of Charley Ross. As always, thanks to everyone who participated. And okay, Carrie, before I close, I don't remember, did the letters stop after the suspects were killed? So when you read the book, you'll see there was letter number 23. And then there was a period of time where, of course, Mr. Ross talks about the difficulty of waiting to see what happens, what's next. This is going along the time when there was discussion of this informant. And then all of a sudden, there is this burglary in which these men eventually end up dead. So it seems to me to be the case that that was it. There was no 23 letters are cited. The 23 letters goes up to that point. And of the actual letters coming from what are perceived to be the actual perpetrators, that was it. Carrie, does that answer your question? Keep in mind, folks, from the start and onward, even beyond this, there were people who were trying to scam the family and others about Charley and other missing children. But yes, these perps letters stopped by the time of the burglary. Yep. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for your time. Thanks to everyone here. Again, folks, have a great week. Yeah, thank you, Carrie, and we appreciate you. Good night, everyone. Thank you, Linda. Folks, have a great week. Again, this is Unfound on the Ground number 19, The Disappearance of Charley Ross. Be well, folks.